Good afternoon and welcome to Florida Supernature. Today's topic, carnivorous plants in Pinellas. It's Wednesday, October 21, believe it or not. My name is James Stevenson and I am with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences Pinellas County Extension. We are an extension of the University of Florida right here in Pinellas County. We are a cooperative. We are a partnership with our local government, Pinellas County government, kind of an offshoot, as it were, a sub-department within the Parks Department. So we're a sub of a sub of a sub, but we are the educational branch of your local government, and we're here to extend research-based information from the University of Florida to the citizens of this county for various reasons. We're probably best known for extending horticultural advice. Our partnership exists to prevent expensive problems for the county, like invasive plants, like the misuse of fertilizers, because when those problems need money to be cleaned up, guess who gets to pay for that? The county, and by extension, the citizens. Exactly. So we're here, hopefully disseminating information in an understandable way so that people can make decisions that won't lead to expensive problems. I'm coming to you today from Brooker Creek Preserve. And if you can see my giant, I hope you can see my giant cursor. Right down here is the logo for Brooker Creek Preserve. We're 9,000 acres of undeveloped Pinellas County. And one of the program areas that the Extension Department focuses on is natural resource conservation. And because tourism traditionally is the #1 driver of the economy in our little county, people come here for the natural resources. They come here for the beaches. They come here for the clean beaches. They come here to hike in places like our beautiful 9,000 acre preserve up here in Tarpon Springs. So conserving these natural areas appeals to both those of us who are concerned about just the preservation of natural areas. But if you think about it, by extension, it also kind of solidifies that economic driver. By protecting our natural resources, we can foster a continuation of positive tourist experiences. And by providing education, we can encourage people to take advantage of our natural areas without having a negative impact. What in the world does that have to do with carnivorous plants? Well, because there are only a few places in the county that are suited for these very interesting groups of plants. Their preservation also extends to the preservation of the habitats that they live in. And so by instilling some information about this group of plants, perhaps raising an interest in this group, or I need to keep saying these groups of plants, the carnivorous plants, perhaps it will instill a feeling of conservation in today's attendance, that when it comes time to speak up for the habitats, we know that you'll be there in our court, so to speak. So let's get started with a look at the carnivorous plants here in Pinellas County. Now, when I was studying in undergraduate many moon ago, there was a discussion amongst the botany community writ large, very diverse, to not refer to these groups of plants as carnivorous. Maybe they should be referred to as insectivorous, because really the majority of the prey species that these plants evolved to consume, literally, were the insects. But it has since been shown that these plants, although they might be pre-evolved to catch and digest insects, they're not picky. And anything that might fall into the trap is fair game. And here we have an online picture of a Venus flytrap, perhaps the best known of the carnivorous plants, snapping down on what looks to be some species of gecko. Perhaps the gecko had crept up on a previous prey species that was still trapped within the Venus flytrap and itself got trapped and will now become the unwitting prey of the Venus flytrap. So some of the things that we'll look at today, and in not necessarily this order, we'll talk about the arrival, the evolution of this carnivorous habit among various different groups of plants. Why did this happen? We'll look at some of the species that you may encounter right here in our overly developed county. They're still around. There's still little pockets here and there where you can visit these interesting, fascinating plants. How the various mechanisms work that leads to the entrapment and digestion of the prey species. And finally, what kinds of things are quote unquote eaten, because of course plants don't eat, they don't have a mouth, but they can catch, digest, and absorb. So in effect, that's how we're going to refer to as these plants eating today. So what are the carnivorous plants? There's a war out there. Plants and insects have been at war. They're in a love-hate relationship, the plants and the insects. Um, Many plants depend on insects for their pollination. So and probably the most critical part of the life cycle of flowering plants is being pollinated. And oftentimes it's an insect vector that makes that possible. But of course, plants can't escape, and plants make very good insect food. So plants have to defend themselves against insects, but not just insects. Plants are sitting targets for all sorts of attacks. So how did this all happen? This war between these various groups, the animals versus the plants, and here we have a silly cartoon of a monster plant going, trying to turn the tables on the whole plant versus insect thing. When you mention carnivorous plants, though, it might what might pop into people's mind is something bloodthirsty with teeth that might be dangerous to people, because when we hear of something that's carnivorous, we think perhaps they're going to be eating, mammals, that sort of thing. Only a small handful of instances where mammals have been discovered as prey victims. Not to say that it can't happen, but generally speaking, when you mention carnivorous plants, people are going to picture this thing from this movie that I never saw that has the giant killer plant. Y'all probably know what I'm talking about. But let's take a very, very high elevated look at this whole situation. If you've had classes or presentations with me before, you know that I kind of like to look at how things are related and where things come from before we drill down into what they actually are. We kind of put them into perspective. So let's start by putting some things in perspective, and let's consider plants as a whole, just the world of plants. So plants are sedentary. That means they don't get up and run around. They're rooted in place. They take carbon dioxide and sunlight and water and turn it into sugar that they use to fulfill their life cycles. The flowering plants produce these lovely blossoms, blooms, flowers, produce fruit with seeds inside. So this is kind of like how plants exist In utopia, in the best case scenario, a plant is going to sit in the nice soil, bathed and with rain and nice warm sunshine. We can think of entire ecosystems and of plants where everything is in harmony. We've got the trees and they've got their epiphytes that are up in the sun, and we've got the understory, and everything is just wonderful, hunky-dory. The plants have their roots in a beautiful soil. Their roots serve to anchor the plants in place, to draw that wonderful moisture and nutrient up out of the soil so that the branches can expand and put the leaves out in the sun to facilitate all that wonderful photosynthesis. And then the magic of photosynthesis, where, as we mentioned, plants can take the sun and the water and the carbon dioxide, represented here by a nice tall drink of fizzy water, uh, all these things together through the magic of photosynthesis, producing sugars and oxygen. Of course, we can take advantage of both of the latter. We love our sugar, all produced from plants. We love our oxygen, couldn't live without it. Uh, so plants sitting in the ground, processing the light, the carbon dioxide, the water in their soil, depend on nutrients. Plants can't just exist on light and carbon dioxide and water alone. There are nutrients that are involved, and these nutrients include kind of the biggie bigs, which is nitrogen, and the second, phosphorus. And then there are some others that are considered the macronutrients that you would find in fertilizer. And the micronutrients, things that are available environmentally, supplemented in smaller quantities, not quite as necessary, but no less important. Bear with me. I don't like chemistry either, so we're going to whip through this part. But we talked about nitrogen being a very important plant nutrient, and nitrogen is important to run a lot of the business that the plant has to conduct to reproduce itself, which is the most important thing, to facilitate the production of those sugars, which are important to the plant and to the overall ecosystem. And here we have, in the perfect world, kind of the nitrogen cycle, where nitrogen can be taken from the atmosphere and turned into a form that's available to plants through the action of the decomposers right here in the center of the slide. Animals defecating, they've already processed a lot of foods. Animals defecating and urinating can make nitrogen, make these nutrients available. Animals dying and decomposing, the decomposers themselves being things like the fungus and the bacteria, turning those complex molecules back down into their component parts and making them available to the plant so that the plant can survive, and not just survive, but thrive. And plants that thrive live to be of a reproductive age. Success is measured in reproductive rate. So plants need to do more than just survive, they have to thrive. And to thrive, plants need these nutrients on top of their basics. Are you following me? Everyone good? I hope so. The world is not a perfect place. We all know this. Sometimes resources are limited. Sometimes, let's go backwards, this beautiful utopia where we have all the decomposers working, nothing's out of whack. We've got the nitrogen fixing bacteria making nitrogen available to the plants. The plants have everything they need to thrive. But sometimes, and not necessarily infrequently, things are a little bit out of whack. The resources could be limited, or the environmental conditions might not necessarily be ideal for that plant to not only survive, but thrive. So what do plants have to do? Plants have to thrive. So plants have to adapt. And that's the beauty, one of the beauties of plants and their relative short life cycles. Plants can reproduce very quickly and they can change relatively quickly over time. As conditions change, so can plants. And plants can adapt and speciate to, they adapt to the circumstances that they find themselves in. And in a situation where nutrients are limited, plants have to find a way with limited access to nutrition to not only survive, but remember they have to thrive. And a nutrient limited situation might be one of 50% of Brooker Creek Preserve is a nitrogen limited system, a nutrient limited habitat. The swamp, nutrient poor, oxygen poor. So, but the plants are thriving because they have adapted. They have adaptations to live in this limited environment. So this is a situation where the nutrients are limited. You can all imagine a situation where environmental conditions aren't the Garden of Eden, yet plants have adapted to thrive in these situations. And here is an environment that I am not adapted to live in. Um, very few living things are adapted to live in, but look, we have the very successful plants. Competition within these habitats where resources are limited, what few resources are available are competed for. So plants have to compete with one another. And what is victory in this competition? The victory is reproduction. So we've got plants that have to live, they have to compete. When things are awesome and everything is wonderful, there's plenty for everyone. There's just rapid reproduction. Imagine the dense rainforest where everything has almost everything it needs. Competition for light, pretty much it. So everything is just, trying to outgrow each other. But when we're talking about some of these habitats and situations where resources are limited, plants have adapted 9 different times to look to living organisms to supplement that limited nutrition. That limited source of nutrition has been discovered by plants and exploited by plants 9 times. So this whole idea of plant carnivory has appeared through history on separate occasions. Not all carnivorous plants are therefore related. There was not a single common ancestor to all the carnivorous plants that gave rise to all the different forms that we have today. We have plants over here. Most of them are not carnivorous, but they have a carnivorous cousin. And so on all along the spectrum of flowering plants. We have this carnivorous nature that has arisen more than once. That is an example of convergent evolution. Convergent evolution means the arrival of a characteristic or trait that has appeared independently more than once. The example that is often floated is the shark and the dolphin. The shark and the dolphin have almost identical body shapes, sizes, and functions. They have pectoral fins, they have dorsal fin, they have the flipper fin, whatever that's called, in order to serve the same purpose, move gracefully through the water and hunt prey. But the shark and the dolphin, bottlenose dolphin, they're not related. Do you get it? They're not related. Shark is a cartilaginous fish. The bottlenose dolphin is a mammal. So you can see the same adaptations to solve the same problem, hunting rapidly in the water, has evolved twice, independent of one another. That's convergent evolution. So in nitrogen and phosphorus limited habitats, carnivory has popped up these several times. Now, what makes a plant a carnivorous plant? Well, it has to meet certain conditions. It has to be able to absorb nutrition from the surface or from a modified interior, not just taking nitrogen through the roots, not taking atmospheric nitrogen or fixed nitrogen through the roots. It has to have some sort of adaptation to absorb that nutrient through the surface. And it has to have at least one adaptation to lure, to draw prey species in, to catch that prey species, and or digest that prey species. So there are plenty of plants that are sticky, but they're not necessarily carnivorous. They might lack the ability to lure, the ability to digest, or the ability to absorb that dead animal from its surface. Plants might be sticky simply to prevent being chewed on. That doesn't make them carnivorous. Do you see what I'm saying? These are the conditions that need to be met in order for a plant by people to be considered carnivorous. So in Pinellas County, we've got these 4 representatives. Well, I should say more like 3.5. We've got a group called the sundews, which you can see in the background of the slide here. We have a group called the butterwort, lovely common name, the butterworts. We have a group called the bladderworts, and we have the pitcher plants. So the sundews, butterworts, bladderworts, and pitcher plants belong to 3 different plant groups. So these are not all related. They are simply carnivorous, okay? So let's take a look at the adaptations. The adaptations when nutrients are limited, that's the limiting factor in Pinellas County. And the plants that we have in our county, the sundews, butterworts, bladderworts, and the pitcher plants, they are all facing and thriving in environments where primarily nitrogen is the limiting factor. So let's have a look at them. The sundews, Drosera is the genus name. The sundew's leaves are modified into these paddle-shaped structures. And then on those structures are these tall stalks, these glands that have little glistening orbs of a resinous, sticky substance. So these plants have got a modification to trap. These droplets are very sticky, and the prey species might be attracted to a shiny little orb of liquid, mistaking it perhaps for nectar, a nectar droplet. So here we have a plant that both lures and traps on its modified leaves. Now these glands, technically these are glands on the surface of this leaf. Glands on the surface of leaves is not unheard of in the plant land. Oftentimes they might be deployed to keep water from being lost. Sometimes they might be deployed to keep plants from being chewed on. In the sundews, these glands are exaggerated to the point where they can lure and trap, and eventually digest its prey species. You can see the scale of our native sundews. This is a pine needle. So they're pretty small, but that's okay because their prey species are small as well. See why they're not a threat to people? Pretty tiny. But where they occur in these kind of nutrient deprived areas, they can occur in very large numbers because they're quite happy. Even though they're not getting much nutrient from the soil at all, they have what else they need. They're anchored to the soil. They have these relatively expensive to produce leaves, but what they get in return is that supplemental nitrogen from absorbing the decomposing bodies, the decomposing amino acids that make up the proteins that make up their prey species. They can absorb that. That's nitrogen that is now readily available to them. One of the limitations of being a carnivore or an insectivore, whichever you want to refer to, is that when it comes to reproduction, you don't want to eat your pollinator. That wouldn't do anyone any good. So here we have the sundew, and in the background you can see a little prey species that's stuck and the little tendrils that have coiled around it, and they're pinning it to the leaf surface. Natural decomposition is taking place. A little bit of augmented decomposition is taking place thanks to some digestive enzymes that the plant is actually secreting that's breaking that prey species down, making that nutrition available to the plant. But here it is, it's going to flower. And the sundews, like never say all, like most carnivorous plants, they're going to hold their flowers way well above their traps because they don't want to trap a pollinator. They don't want to compromise the pollinators' business of the day, which would be visiting flowers to pick up nectar, transferring that nectar to a different species. So I like the photograph on the left because you can see the traps way down below. They're even out of focus when you focus up here on the individual flower buds. And here we have a flower bud that's open, presenting itself to pollinators way up high in the air. So the sundews have this figured out as far as preventing themselves from eating their pollinators. And just like all flowering plants, they've got all the requisite parts. They've got the pollen, they've got the stigma, there's an ovary, there's going to be seeds developed later. The seeds are going to have some sort of dispersal mechanism. Just like all the other flowering plants, the sundews, they just have the sinister ability to catch and digest living prey, to survive and thrive. Remember, today's word of the day is thrive in these nutrient poor soils. For scale, here's our Julia observing a patch, as we mentioned, locally abundant, very densely packed in, not much competition. You can see not competing for much. There's not much that can grow in this very acidic pine needles, very acidic, wet, saturated soils, just not perfect, but not much competition with anything else for these sundews as they have adaptations to thrive in this nutrient poor soil. There is a trade-off. Here we have our sundew with a little, what looks like was a honeybee. The trade-off, of course, is that the carnivorous plants modify their leaves to facilitate the luring, entrapment, and digestion of their prey. Now, you know what a leaf's primary job is? What of all the organs of a plant, the roots, the stems, the leaf organ, its primary job of course, is photosynthesis. These plants are still photosynthetic. They have to be, but they have to trade some of that photosynthetic ability for the carnivorous lifestyle. So, you know, let's just throw out a percentage. 60% of this leaf structure has been given over for the entrapment and the luring, the entrapment, and the digestion of the prey species. It's come at a cost to photosynthesis. Therefore, these plants have to live in the brightest sunlight they can find. You'd be hard pressed in the new world to find carnivorous plants living in the shade because they need all the sunlight they can get. That leads me to a little side note. The carnivorous plants thrive in nutrient poor soil because they have this adaptation to grab nitrogen in the form of living prey. If you were to take these plants and put them into human cultivation, humans tend to dote on their plants and give them all the water they need, fertilizer when they need it. These plants have in their blueprint the ability to let go of their carnivorous lifestyle. If an individual plant suddenly finds itself in a nutrient rich, if something should change, these leaves can change, lose all that sticky surface area, lose all those um, glands that trap insects, and just go back to being photosynthetic. Oftentimes, you'll see this if people are trying to grow the Venus flytrap as a pet, as it were. Um, they're given all these wonderful ideal garden conditions. They stop making traps. They don't need the supplemental anymore, and they just uh, carry on as a normal plant. So again, going back, we've got the plants that can take the sunlight, the carbon dioxide, the water, and turn it into sugar and oxygen. That's the basics of what's going on inside plants. So the various different types of traps, what we just looked at is what's referred to as the fly paper trap. Um, Maybe you've heard of flypaper. Maybe it's still around. Maybe it's out there somewhere. But there's a human construct called flypaper where we put down a sticky surface. Flies are attracted to the color. So the pests are attracted to the color. They get their feet stuck. It's a way of pest management. The flypaper trap, when we're referring to carnivorous plants, are just those. We have the lure, being perhaps the nectar mimicry. The nectar in this case actually being a thick resin or resinous type substance that sticks to the prey. The prey struggles. The more it struggles, the more of this viscous liquid it gets entangled in and finally gets absorbed as it decomposes. Another one of the flypaper trap type carnivorous plants that we have here in Pinellas County is the butterwort. So we've looked at the sundew. This is a completely different. This is the butterwort. And again, we have modified leaves. These leaves are covered in sticky hairs. In this case, if you look very closely, you can see the hairs are much, much finer. They exude more of a mucus type substance. So it's not discrete little bundles. The color is what attracts the little gnats. If you see, these traps are covered in little gnats and they're attracted to the color yellow. And those gnats are now being digested on the surface of the leaf and absorbed. The leaf edges, you'll notice on the butterwort, are curled in so that if a little gnat or a little microinvertebrate, little invertebrate, little tiny mosquito along those lines, if they were to try and find their way to the edge of the leaf to walk off the edge, there's no edge. They come to this ridge and they can't get past that. So pretty devious, but it works. Again, the butterworts, they need to not eat their pollinators. So here's another group of plants, the butterworts, where they produce their insectivorous trap leaves, their flypaper trap leaves, well away from their flowers because they don't want to eat their pollinators. This is Pinguicula lutea, which means the yellow or the golden butterwort. We also have little Pinguicula pumila, and pumila means little. Here's another one, and again, for scale, folks, these are pine needles. So you can see this is a tiny little thing. This entire rosette, which is what we refer to as kind of that fan, circular fan shape of leaves, covered in those glandular hairs that are secreting the mucus. You can see the upturned leaf edges, preventing any of the little gnats from going to the edge and leaving. They're just going to have to stay where they are, be decomposed, and be absorbed. But again, even on this tiny little scale, little Pinguicula pumila will produce a flower well away from its sticky trap. And we've seen these. You can see, again, for scale, the maple leaves, the pine needles, and a little bit of moss on one of the trails up here at Brooker Creek. This species happens to be an annual species. That means it comes up, grows, traps insects, flowers, goes to seed, and then the entire plant dies by the winter time. So it's a 1 year only, it's an annual carnivorous plant. Most of these other representatives live from year to year to year to year. Another type of trap that is prevalent within carnivorous plants are the bladder suction traps. Now, the flypaper traps we've seen exist in the sundews, and they exist also in the butterworts. Those two are not related, but they have the same mechanism, that flypaper. The bladder suction trap only exists in this one group, the bladderworts, the utricularias. And these are kind of 50% aquatic species and 50% terrestrial species. So some have leaves that are modified to float in the water, and they can catch aquatic invertebrates. They can catch aquatic insects. They can catch aquatic, what are those things called? What are crabs called? Crustaceans. They can catch little crustaceans in their bladders that live in the water. So here's an aquatic carnivorous plant. Again, producing their flowers well up above. This one is, there's two that look very, very similar. This is probably one called inflata, Utricularia inflata. Again, modified leaves. These leaves are modified to be the floating devices. And then we'll take a look in just a second. The other leaves have been modified into these little threads, lots and lots and lots of little threads. And it's on those threads that the bladder suction organs exist. So here's a picture of the habit and the habitat of this particular species. We have various aquatic species, several with yellow flowers, one with purple flowers. Here you can see from our episode, if you will, of the pond, we were standing on the edge of the pond here, and all these tiny little yellow dots in the distance, those are all bladderwort flowers, breaking the surface, staying away, not eating their pollinators, with the traps being underground. So let's just take a look at this video here of what those underwater leaves look like. Now here's the vegetative leaves with my hand as a backdrop. And here you can see those bladders. So these are modified leaves here, and on each one of those, here's the photosynthetic leaves. You can see they're very finely branched. There's probably a few bladders through there, but next to it, you can see the bladders more prevalent on the other types of leaves. So a couple of different types of leaves on the same plant. And how do I get out? I forgot. Kill you? Yes. So the bladders themselves are pretty much microscopic. And the way that the bladders work, they're hollow little vessels that are produced by the species that we just looked at underwater. But the terrestrial ones produce these same little bladders underground. They're hollow. The plant can actually force a vacuum by growing the walls, squeezing the walls of this little bladder shut, forcing all the air and water out of the bladder. There are trigger hairs, very sensitive trigger hairs that extend from the front of the bladder. So if something like a little underwater flea were to swim by and trip that trigger hair, it forces this open, and suction, this vacuum is opened, and it sucks in the unwitting little water flea. The trap shuts behind it, and the digestion begins to take place, and that water flea is broken down and effectively consumed. So that's an example of the aquatic. Here we have one of our most prevalent carnivorous plants. This is called the zigzag plant. This is a bladderwort that is terrestrial, and it grows quite happily here in damp soil. So it's catching underground creatures like nematodes, those little tiny, tiny microscopic worms, and other little tiny, tiny, tiny crawlies that might pass by those trigger hairs and get sucked into those tiny little bladders. So again, nutrient poor soils. Here we have an insectivorous plant that has actually made it on land. And finally represented, probably, maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, in Pinellas County, the pitcher plants, the pitfall traps. So it's a pit. It's a pitfall. We visited these plants. These photographs were actually taken at the Brooker Creek headwaters, which is actually in Hillsborough County. The pitcher plants, we believe, unfortunately, have been chased out of Pinellas County. Thanks to development, perhaps we've taken away all the habitat that the pitcher plants had inhabited here in Pinellas County. Some people are so enamored of the whole concept of carnivorous plants. Man, there are plants that eat animals. They go out and they dig them up and keep them as pets, as I mentioned before. And so that's another pressure that's on a lot of these plants, is that people just want to go out and get them and have them and then kill them because they think they need to feed them a hamburger. The end. Anyway, the pitfall traps represented here by the pitcher plants, photographs taken in Hillsborough County. We're hoping someday to find a colony or several colonies here at Brooker Creek Preserve. There's no reason not to think that there's some pitcher plants out here somewhere. And we would definitely keep that very secret. But they are certainly, where they are present, they are abundant. Their habitat, however, is threatened. So they are considered threatened or endangered. Do you see what I'm saying? So when you find them, you find a lot of them, but you're going to find fewer places where they exist. So their habitat loss is leading to their designation as being endangered. Now, what's a pitfall trap? The leaves in this group are modified into a hollow cone with, in this case, a little hood. So this is a hollow cone, and there's the opening. These plants were flowering. So again, they're trying to get their flowers up above the leaves before the leaves open and the traps become active. Here's last year's leaves. They're all done. They're probably full of prey, and they've absorbed all the nutrient they're going to, and so the individual leaf is going to die away, making room for this year's pitcher. The pitfall traps are constructed with very, very thin leaf walls just here. Those white spots are actually, they're not colored white, they're just very, very thin leaf material. And here we have the giant flower. Flower again, the flower not playing any part in the carnivory, the flower simply wanting to get its pollen to the next plant. But how the pitfall works is here are those thin areas of leaf. And here you can see the opening into that hollow leaf structure. And so just imagine all of this in this two-dimensional picture where we have the lure, this lip, which has some really lovely, sweet substance. I wouldn't, maybe it's considered nectar, but it's not nectar that's associated with a flower. It's just to attract something that likes sugar. So insect is going to fly in. Here's my cursor, buzz, buzz, buzz. I smell nectar, buzz, buzz, and it lands on this little area here. Has a little nectar snack. And then the thin cell layers, the thin leaf here creates a window. And so little insect that's sitting on the lip is covered in shade. And insects don't like shade. They fly towards the sun. So when it comes time to take off, the little insect is going to fly towards these windows. And look where the windows are situated. They're situated to where if the insect were to fly, they're going to fall down into this trap. There are hairs along the inside of that pitfall that prevent the insect from climbing back out, or making it extremely difficult, we'll put it that way, for the insect to crawl back out. It's going to continually lose its footing and fall back into the trap. For scale, here is what the Sarracenia, this is what people look like to a Sarracenia. They're small, that's why they're called Sarracenia minor, the ones that we have here. Fingers crossed in Pinellas County, but certainly only about 4 or 5 miles away. But falling down into that trap, they will eventually encounter a pool of water. And the water, the surface tension, you know what I'm talking about, surface tension? A lot of bugs can just land on top of the water and not sink. These plants can produce a surfactant that breaks the surface tension and causes the insect to sink. So it doesn't get any better for the insect as this goes along. It gets worse. So now we've fallen in the trap, broken the surface tension and sunk, and we've sunk into this digestive juice that once the animal is dead, becomes part of this insect smoothie that we discovered when we opened. Here's one of the leaves and here's the hollow trap. And right down there in the bottom of this hollow trap are the decomposing bodies of those insects. Let's look at that a little bit closer because we just can't get gross enough. Almost as gross as the fingernails. So those are our Pinellas County insectivorous plants, the carnivorous plants that you might be able to visit in parks and preserves right here in Pinellas. So let's talk about the Venus flytrap. That's the one that everybody knows. Well, the Venus flytrap is only one of 2 species of insectivorous plants. It only has one relative it lives all over the world, but only in maybe 9 different places between Croatia and Australia, the closest relative to the Venus flytrap. The ones with the snap traps, the ones that actually you can watch move shut, that's what everybody likes. All these other things are kind of boring. Like the prey lands and dies and rots. Snore, the fun stuff is when you can actually see plants move, and that would be the snap trap of the Venus flytrap and of its relative. Can't remember what it's called, another snap trap, but it's an aquatic snap trap. We don't get to see the Venus flytraps here. There is a few escaped populations that have established themselves in the Panhandle. Not native, escaped, exotics. Are they invasive? Not yet. Obviously, they were cultivated for to humor, people just like to keep, like I said, as pets, and they got loose and they're reproducing in the panhandle, but they're not native to Florida. You can see their native range is very limited, not because they're close to a meteor that came from Venus. That's not it. Because they're very extremely particular to the habitat in which they live. Things have to be just perfectly horrible for the Venus flytrap to thrive with its modified leaves that act as this snap trap. The snap trap for the Venus flytrap, these plants can count to 3. So they have these trigger hairs on these modified leaves. If 1 trigger hair is stimulated, nothing happens. If 2 trigger hairs are stimulated, nothing happens. But if 3 trigger hairs are stimulated in rapid succession, that is what triggers the trap to snap shut in on the prey victim. So let's just, y'all recall these terms while I get a quick sip. We're talking carnivory is an adaptation. It's a response to limited resources in a particular habitat. It is a competitive edge. It provides a competitive edge. Remember the victory, reproduction. They are modified leaves. The organ of carnivory is the leaf, and that comes with a trade-off. Sacrificing some of your photosynthesis for the capture of a prey species simply to have an edge in the nutrition department. How does this work? How do these plants digest? That's been a big question of mine ever since I was a little kid. What are you talking about digestive enzymes? We're talking about plants here. We'll think back to the beginning of the presentation, and we have the perfect scenario. We have plants sitting still, stuck in the ground, can't move, can't escape, dependent on the environment to provide everything, dependent on the environment to provide the sunlight, the carbon dioxide, and the water so that the sugars can be made, dependent on the environment to provide the nitrogen in a form that's available for the plant to absorb. Some bacteria can take atmospheric nitrogen and make it into a form that's available to the plant. The decomposers are also adept at breaking down complex molecules into their component parts with nutrient therefore being made available to the plants. And that's done by the decomposers. But look who the decomposers are. The decomposers are the fungus and the bacteria. And we know that fungus and bacteria are known for something else, not just decomposing, don't we? When you think of a fungus on your plants or a bacteria on your plants, we're thinking about pathogens. So a plant sitting there defenseless, ostensibly, dependent on its environment for everything, is a sitting target for attack by pathogens. But plants have figured it out. Plants are the ultimate synthesizers. And just like plants can synthesize sugar almost magically out of nothing, plants can also synthesize antimicrobials, substances that can kill or at least discourage the growth of bacteria and fungus, pathogens, organisms that would otherwise impede and keep the plant from thriving. The synthesis of these antimicrobials have been taken advantage of by people. We like the way they taste, these antimicrobials, we call them spices. A lot of times the essential oils that, smell good and have all these magic powers, they're actually derivatives of plant antimicrobials, and they've been shown to have these antimicrobial activities. And we'll dive more into plants' abilities to produce these poisons for their own defense next week when we talk about plant poison at 2 o'clock on the 28th. So these antimicrobials include the antibacterials because they don't want to get a blight, and they include the fungicides because fungus will tear up a plant if they can get a hold of it. So plants can produce these fungicides. Why am I going off on this tangent? Because fungus, you can picture a fungus. Here we have a picture of a fungus. You don't have to, but you know what I'm talking about. This, it's not a plant, it's not an animal, it's not a bacteria, it's a fungus. It's its own kingdom. And fungus are made out of little fine fibers called hyphae, mycelium. They're all woven together, little tubes called hyphae. And fungus, hyphae, mycelium, all these things that the thing is made out of is a protein called chitin. So fungus is made out of chitin. Is it a protein? Is it carbohydrate? I think it's a carbohydrate. Those look like a lot of C's and H's and O's. Anyway, chitin is this kind of plastic. It's like natural plastic that is what fungus is made of. And plants can synthesize these compounds that rip chitin apart. And therefore, it's called chitinase, which is an enzyme that can take chitin apart. That's the digestive enzyme. It's the chitinase. So plants have evolved the ability to produce chitinase to take fungus apart so it can't hurt them. But there's something else that's made out of chitin. Insects are made of chitin. And so plants already had the ability to synthesize a substance that could very easily be modified, not to break down fungus, but instead to tear apart the exoskeleton of an insect. And that substance is chitinase, and that's what these insectivorous plants have ramped up. That's the digestive enzyme that the plants use to tear up the insects to cause them to digest. So remember, carnivorous plants, the conditions that make a carnivorous plant, it has to be able to absorb through the interior, not through the roots, but it actually has to have evolved a mechanism to absorb through the surface of the plant. And it has to at least lure and trap, or lure or trap and or digest that prey species. So those are the carnivorous plants in a nutshell. Again, going a little bit over time as I am wont to do. We'll just recall rather quickly the sundews with their flypaper traps, the butterworts with their flypaper traps, native here in this part, the bladderworts with that crazy bladder that sucks microscopic organisms in, and the pitcher plants, the pitfall plants, which hopefully we're going to find in Pinellas County. But if you do want to go visit the pitcher plants, Brooker Creek Preserve headwaters would be your place to go. And remember, all plants on all preserves are protected all the time. So thank you very much for tuning in today. Join us next week for Plant Poison. That's going to wrap up Florida Supernature for the year. Trying to keep this kind of creepy theme, poisons and spiders and insectivorous plants for October. November, we're going to take a look at meteorology. We're going to have Brian McClure back, and he's going to take us through Weather 102. And we'll have an opportunity to ask him our weather questions now that knock knock hurricane season is over. And then we have a really, really great presentation coming up on the 18th. Uh, Nature University, the weather will be at 1 o'clock, special time. We'll send out an announcement about that. Also going to be on our Facebook page. November 18th, back at 2 o'clock with our friend Brian, who's a nature photographer, fantastic nature photographer, and a graduate of Cornell University studying birds. And we'll take a look at Florida birds through the seasons, how they migrate, why they migrate, and what species we might see where and when. If you need to scoot, I totally understand. What I'm going to do right quick, though, is I'm going to open the chat and see what y'all have to say. Oh, hello. Little Shop of Horrors is the name of that. Thank you. What is the oldest carnivorous plant in Florida, and how old is it? That's a really great question. Generally speaking, the plants that exist in Florida, not only do they live in these nitrogen poor ecosystems, but they're also fire dependent. So we have cases where these plants might only live for a dozen or so years before a massive fire would come through. So we don't get to have 1,000-year-old carnivorous plants. Generally speaking, the perennial species, they live for 10, 20 years, something like that. How does the rain affect the sundew sticky material and its ability to capture prey? Very good question. Rain, of course, is going to be a limiting factor. You don't want your prey washed away. The exudite, the viscous substance, is actually waterproof. So although it is sticky and wet, it is actually not water soluble, so that after a rain, the plant can just produce that little bit more and it's right back in business. How would you grow, if you were going to grow a sundew? A lot of these plants are available for sale from nurseries that grow these plants from tissue culture. So they're no longer collected from the wild. So if you are interested in growing these as pets, as I mentioned before, you're going to receive them in the soil that they're best suited to growing in. Generally, they'll arrive in what's called milled sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss you might be familiar with. Sphagnum is a soil improvement. It's going to be very acidic and just as it comes, very nutrient poor. So what it's growing in when you get it from a accredited nursery is what it can probably live in for the rest of its life. What time of year do they flower? Generally speaking, April here in Florida. Before we're looking at the end of the dry season. So we're looking at naturally where the fires would stop coming through like they do over the winter. They push through their flowers and then they grow their new leaves. So around April time. The little terrestrial bladderwort, the zigzag plant, that one seems to flower year round. So you can almost always find a little tiny yellow flower of the zigzag plant or the zigzag bladderwort. Thank you very much for your comments. Any carnivorous plants in Pasco County, Florida? A good way to find out that information would be to go and visit the Florida Plant Atlas. What you can do, actually, I might be able to show you the Florida Plant Atlas if you just bear with me. We use the Florida Plant Atlas quite a lot when we do our. So what are you looking for? Carnivorous plant. Let's just look up Drosera. And we'll look up brevifolia. And here you can see the map of where this particular species of sundew has been vouchered. So you can do a little look-see and just find out what you can expect to find in your county. You're probably not going to be given actual location data. You would have to consult with your extension service. Location data is often hidden, especially with endangered plants, because there are people that'll go out and steal them. So If you're very interested in carnivorous plants, or if you want to pursue this any further, there are carnivorous plant societies, and you can meet like-minded people and certainly experts that would know a million times more than I about this group, perhaps where you could actually find them growing in the wild, or gardens where you might be able to visit them that are growing, as I keep saying, as pets. Thanks for joining us. Oh, if they normally digest the chitin, how does the process of captured vertebrate prey? The vertebrate prey, those tend to be the handful of times that those have happened, they fell into the giant Sumatran pitchers, and it was just the tropical heat. The bacteria did the work and liquefied that vertebral prey species. And I have a feeling we looked at early on that the little gecko in the Venus flytrap, that probably just had the bacterial rot that produced that small bit of ooze that the plant was then able to absorb, because the plant is pre-adapted to absorb nutrient through its leaf tissue. All right, well, thanks for joining us. I'm going to hang up and hope that I see you all again next week for plant poison on the 28th. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.